Right, thank you very much. So, as James was mentioning, I work on this project called Jenkins, and I just realized that I didn't even put the slide on it. So, like, this is the Mr. Jenkins. So one of the things that I really care about in that project is the sort of scalability of the development. You know, how it is an open source project where about 800 to 1,000 people have contributed, and then there's a lot of active plugin ecosystem going on. And so one of the things that I deeply care about is like how we could sort of collaborate, but being a geek, that's not really sort of like an introvert type. Like my goal is to sort of how sort of in that kind of context we could sort of work together without really actually not working together. So so in this talk, so I wanted to explore this part and why I think why it matters. So just to sort of set the context, in open source projects, often there's this notion of committers, right? So those are chosen few elite people. You kind of have to stick around in the project long enough, and then so that the other people in the project know you, and then like you basically prove yourself that you're an okay, decent guy, that they'll be willing to trust you. So the act of getting a committership is a little bit like a knighthood, and that it's a sort of it's a status that people tend to crave for. Now, obviously, the fact that these are chosen few really sort of reduces the slowdown, the scale of the development. So perhaps as an antithesis, there's the other thing called the open commit policy, the idea that, okay, everyone gets to be committer, so it's like a communist, socialist, happy state of the world. And this is actually how Jenkins project is run. And then the part of the talk I did the year before was actually related to that. So recently, so this Charles Nutter, who is actually I worked on another very famous open source project called JRuby, has this thing to say. So he basically said that the open commit policy, the idea that everyone can be a committer even before proving themselves, is a kind of thing of the past now, because the GitHub introduced a way to sort of create, basically introduced a new model called the pull request that allows people to basically hack on the code and then basically ask the people maintaining the project to integrate those. So if it's easy enough to just hack the code and ask you to integrate the changes, as opposed to getting the committership first and then write the changes, then what's the point of this this seeming difference between these two things? And then so that is indeed, in a way, I totally understand where he's coming from. So it's for the same reason you do not take in a random stranger into your car for hitchhiking. Because you really can't trust her, right? So I mean, what if she's like a sociopath or like a serial killer? All sorts of bad things could happen. So in a way, it's a little bit like letting random people commit to your code base is like leaving your house without locking the door. And then I even saw one guy, on this topic said, like, as a owner of the project, you owe it to the users of your project to be very selective. And he was basically boasting that he had to turn down some of the changes, even though it was perfectly coded, tested, documented, but just because it just, wasn't compatible with the direction that the project was trying to head to. Now, because I'm in the open commit policy project, so I have other angle to these issues, like the fact that, even if you end up taking a bad guy, it's not like he can kill you in code base, right? I mean, the worst thing he can do is to commit some stupid changes, and then I know just the right command to roll back that change. That's the whole point of having version control system is for. So I actually wrote some blog post about this. But actually, so what I came to realize is that this idea, for example, that whether the pull request made it easy enough to substitute for committer access, or maybe whether the pull request is actually creating a wrong incentive because it's really reducing the need to become the insider of the project. But this project was actually sort of like a wrong moot point. That I thought, I used to think that the open commit policy was actually a very important part of creating scalable community. But as I was thinking about this problem, what I came to realize is that the real problem is the fact that the people kind of have to sort of argue their points and then try to convince each other about how to do certain things. Like, I want this functionality because I think this is, this does X and Y and it's useful for Z. And then the other guy would say, but then it's not really compatible with W, and then so on and so forth. So they kind of have to negotiate things around. And like I said, the geeks are generally not good at these things. We don't want to do these things. So the fact that you have to justify the changes, defend the additions, and so on, and the fact that you have to argue them and convince you is actually, I think, is sort of the real problem. Because when you think about, this is actually a very typical model in which the software gets developed. If you look at, say, like a Linux kernel, these things are going on all the time. Like, people propose reasonable features, but they get turned down because of various reasons. So in this kind of context, for example, one thing that stops happening is the supporting fringe use cases. As the guy who maintains a project, you end up carrying whatever baggage people drops on you. So say if someone proposes a feature that's only useful for say 3% of the user base, like say Windows support, and then like you have to say, I'm sorry, I blame it on beer. Then those things ends up not happening. Another real problem is that if the project has already endeavored on one approach, then and then if someone proposes another conflicting idea, on its own it could be perfectly valid idea or the perfect approach, but just because they already kind of embarked on this one thing, it stops being happening. So I think of these models, when these things are actively suppressed, it's sort of the picture that you should be imagining in your head is like Steve Jobs and iPhone model, where sort of every feature is carefully removed, and basically the one guy dictates what happens in the project line. But I actually think that is, for most of us at least, is not the right model. I think what I really sort of strive for in the Jenkins project is more like a Linux kernel, or the GNU ecosystem, like very chaotic, bazaar-ish development model where lots of interesting ideas gets tried, and many of them fail, but it sort of creates a really thriving, vibrant ecosystem. So, the problem of sort of the one guy or the small number of guys, aka small number of guys, like you should picture committers, in charge of the sort of inbound changes is that even with the distributed version control system, the guy that owns the sort of the code repository and controlling the access, the inflow of the changes, like which commits land in that repository, has an incredible advantage of being that gatekeeper. So let's say you have some small community of the project. You got the guy in the middle is the committer that's basically the owner of the project, and then there's users and developers around you. And then so what happens is that say one of the people come up with like a way to do some interesting things by maybe making some changes, fixing bugs. So for her to be able to actually integrate the changes and sort of get that idea, some idea to do something different, she has to first convince you, the guy in the middle. And then only after the guy accepts that change, it becomes visible to all the other people. The fact that you're sort of the hub of the communication makes you sort of like a gatekeeper in the bottleneck. I mean, it's like the fact that the communication happened in this way is the slowdown that this causes. You can imagine what it's like if in this conference, if you can only talk to the speakers, right? That would be sort of like you can imagine how limiting it is. And so it's a great tragedy that, especially because the way developers communicate these ideas is actually by writing code. So the English is actually a very painful, imprecise language to use for communicating ideas. The way we do it in the developer community is actually by writing code. Instead of trying to justify something you're thinking about building, you just build them and show it to them. So that's how we work. So when that's happening, but because as just one person in the community, you don't have the same platform that the committer has. As a user of the project, I mean, how many times do you look at the pull request being discussed in the upstream repository? Not too often. So I would even argue that it's kind of arrogant as a guy in the middle to think that he can correctly judge all the interesting new ideas on behalf of the users. it's sort of denying that innovation will happen elsewhere. So, when you end up being in this situation, the guy who has to, look at all the changes and approve them and push into changes, you end up becoming the guy in here. There's like the people are trying to pass through you, but you're standing on the wrong side of things, so there's like a queue that clogs up. It prevents people from getting from where they are to where they want to go. So you really want to step aside so that you really want to step aside so that people can do whatever they want to do with the code base that you partially provided. So that I think is the part of the key insight into creating a plugin ecosystem, the extension point, and all the wonderful world of modularity. So I thought perhaps this is actually open source only problem, but then I switched from from my brief time at Oracle into CloudBees, and I discovered that it's actually not just open source project. Even in a corporate environment, this actually I discovered it seems to apply a lot. So in fact, if anything, this would even make a better case here because in CloudBees, we use I suppose in most enterprises, every employee probably gets access to most code repositories. So yes, it's already open commit policy. And then we certainly use Git, and I think many companies do use distributed version control system. And then many of you might even use GitHub, so you get the pull request. But again, that doesn't mean you have this a scalable development where people could try random ideas and fail fast. Right? It just doesn't happen. So what ends up happening is that the people end up sort of arguing with you, that they have to first convince you, the guy who owns whatever portion of the system, to make something happen for them. So how many times did you hear from, say, the marketing people that, can our software do X or Y? And then when they ask you, can you do X, which means please do X, right? They are not just asking yes, no answer. Or the business development people might come back and say, we know we integrate with X, Y, and Z, and we just find another team, another company that does WW, which is very similar, so that can we just develop an interesting proof of concept integration and so that we can show that to the other team. Or maybe the CEO might one day decide that, we have X and we have Y, so why can't we just combine these two things in a slightly different way, which might appeal to different audiences, or it might help raise more money or whatever the reasons of the month. So all these things, whenever people come up with new ideas, those are all, not all perfectly, but sometimes, most of those are stupid ideas. But sometimes, some of these ideas would indeed turned out to be great. And then the thing is, we cannot really tell up front. Really, the only way to find that, in my opinion, is to let them do it and then see if it flies. Because if you're really good at predicting which one works and which one doesn't, then we wouldn't be struggling like this hard, right? So it's inherently difficult. So I think as a developer, what I think we should be all striving for is try to stop being the guy in the middle and then try to just step aside so that these people who come up with ideas could hack the code, or they could find another person to hack the code and then show it to the other relevant stakeholder without ever bothering you whatsoever. And if it turns out that so these people should be responsible for bringing the resources to actually try their ideas. And when they come up with, idea is cheap, right? It's actually making it happen is the hard part. So don't make their idea don't make them work. Don't make them use you to try their ideas. It's their responsibility to do it. Right? So talk is cheap, so you want them to show you the code. So what I think you really want is to structure things in certain ways so that you, the developer, could kind of get out of the way. You see that guy. That's again another elevator pitch. You see this frowning faces behind this guy. So so that's what's happening behind you. And even if you're well-intended, because you end up becoming the bottleneck. So I keep mentioning, how to structure the project, if you structure projects accordingly. So put bluntly, I think the key part is the key observation is the modularity and extensibility. Now, if I'm really talking to like the developers who write code, I mean, I can launch into all sorts of like a coding level things, but assuming that this audience is not interested in that kind of details, I thought I was trying to think of another example here. So, so the idea of the modularity and extensibility is sort of, I think, best captured in the Lego blocks, and I also happen to like Lego a lot. So, so like one day, so the idea being, well, you might want to divide things up, but also make things composable. So the idea is that, well, you put together certain things in certain ways. Like, I happen to think this is awesome, but then if I show it to my daughter, she has like a totally different trade-off that she sees, right? So the pink is good, the flower is good. So this would be so much more awesome if it's got more flower on it. And then, so I happen to disagree. But so the fact that like I was able to communicate what I produced, and then she got inspired and then tried to take it on her own, is good. Like what I did was partially contributing, and I don't have to maintain this. That's her program. So that's the idea. Or you might say, well, the car needs to fly, right? This is 21st century. So allowing people to sort of like build on top of what you did, but sort of in a way that allows different kind of trade-offs and different ways to sort of apply these things. I think that's the sort of real key to the modularity and extensibility. Now, so when I talk about these things to the programmers, well, programmers are lazy bunch, so there's one of the arguments I hear is, well, in my mind, okay, so my software is perfect, but in my mind, I know I've anticipated all these potential future use cases, and I know just what to do when that happens. But I'm not doing it right now because who knows whether those kind of things will materialize later. So it's over-engineering to spending time for modularity now when we have no idea if it be actually ever used is stupid. So I find that to be truly unfortunate. So the guy who actually wrote the code, that see the modularity, like a modularity boundary in their code base, because that's how, he designed it, obviously. But as a guy who comes from outside, like if so the guy that sort of looks at the existing piece, unless the modular boundary is like really visible, like I have no idea where to take things apart and pull things back in. I don't want to fork the code, right? I just want to reuse pieces of it with the sort of some expectation that you'd honor the boundary. So I often see this imaginary modular projects. It's perfectly modular in the eyes of the guy who wrote the code, but for everyone else, it's just totally invisible. It's like a whole bunch of series of classes and the functions and methods, and they might be well written, but there's no clear boundary between them. In contrast, like if you look at, I guess this is apparently like someone did the R2D2, in case it's not obvious, in like I guess the clay mold. Now, if you look at the Lego R2D2, and Lego is an awesome company, so I'm really glad they're still in business. These things actually have a major modularity point, like the whole head would come off, or the whole arm would come off. And then, so those sort of large-scale modularity boundary is really obvious for anyone looking at that side. And those easy things can be easily done. And if you need to find, really dig into deeper, individual bricks can be obviously separated. So that provides a great way to create modularity. And so that's the kind of thing that I wish more software provides. So people create awesome things, and I want to take it and then do some slightly different things that might not make sense to the original developer. But I want to do it, and so please let me do it so that I don't have to convince you to get some things done. I'd rather want to do it on my own. So that was, and then that was that. But in the modern world of connected computing, it turned out that this kind of modularity now extends farther beyond a single sort of program, single process that runs in the system. You kind of have to involve multiple systems, and often this in the company environment, like in the cloud base, we run some services, and then so that consists of a lot of small pieces that's independently owned by like a team of people, right? And I assume this is probably common very common everywhere. But so what happens is that this exact same dilemma would happen. So say like one day, like one Christmas vacation, I get bored and I'm not really a good husband, like I end up coding. And then so I come up with some potentially interesting idea. Okay, maybe 80% chance of crazy, stupid idea, but 20% chance of good ideas. But it turns out that I might be able to hack the code, like put some new things in, but it needs to work in the context of all the other services. And now if I have to go talk to individual owner of these things so that I could experiment with it, then it's not going to fly because they have actual real deliverables and money to make, not those like a Christmas fun hobby projects, right? So it prevents. But the fact that they have this priority, and if their system isn't written so that like I could just take them and then use it and experiment them, it really suppress my trying out these new ideas. And it happens in a lot of context situations that really sort of is unfortunate. So so I think as a developer, the sort of friction to express ideas in code really affects the scalability of the engineering. That's what I'm discovering. So the fact that like I can come up with ideas, but I cannot really hack the code and use PCs, or I can hack the code, but I cannot really use existing surrounding system to talk to mine. That sort of suppresses my ability to try new things, try out new ideas in the code. And it's not exactly easy how to figure those things out. I mean, in Jenkins project, we certainly spent a lot of effort doing it. And in CloudBees, I certainly don't claim that we figured them all out. But if you actually work out the formula, for example, in some of these projects, they made the right thing the easiest thing to do. It set the right expectation for how the community is supposed to work, and then everyone gets to do their own little things, and then it still nonetheless contribute value to the overall ecosystem. So it creates this sort of amazing effect. And then on the service side, I don't really have a good example, but from looking from outside, the Netflix guy seems to have figured out this like a formula of lower level services and the way they deploy the application that seems to be conducive to this idea of trying out new things without rebuilding everything. So once you do these things, I think it really sort of turns into a quite great thing. So I really wanted to. So if you're the guy who owns some existing system, I think it is your responsibility so that other people could take your pieces and try out new ideas, right? And then it is the responsibility of all these other guys not to come to you to ask you to do stuff, but instead they should be doing it on their own, right? So that I think combined, and then would lead to the greatness. So all I'm asking is just get out of the way so that like my lane is straight so that I could try things on my own. So that's it. Thank you very much.